A millionaire slapped a 68-year-old waitress so hard her glasses flew across the dining room floor. 30 guests sat frozen at their tables, forks halfway to their mouths, too afraid of his name to say a single word. He laughed like a king who had never once been told no. He had absolutely no idea that her son was an active-duty Navy SEAL home on emergency leave, and that in exactly 11 minutes, that son was going to walk through the restaurant's front door with a decorated military dog at his side. Before we get into it, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this move something in you, go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss one. The town of Millbrook Harbor sat on the main coastline the way an old photograph sits in a drawer. Quiet, a little faded at the edges, and full of things nobody talked about anymore. Fog rolled in most mornings off the Atlantic, curling around the lobster boats and the church steeple and the long dock that the tourists liked to photograph. It was late September, and the maples along Harbour Street had already started turning the colour of rust and candlelight. Margaret Doyle had waited tables at the Gilded Oyster for 31 years. She was 68 now, small and silver-haired, with hands that shook faintly in the cold mornings, but steadied the moment she picked up a coffee pot. She wore her uniform pressed and her shoes soft-soled, and she moved through the dining room with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had served 3 generations of the same wealthy families, and buried a husband who had loved her plainly and completely for 40 years. She didn't need the job anymore, not really. Her son sent money home every month, whether she asked for it or not, and her little house near the harbour was paid off years ago. But Margaret liked the rhythm of it, the clatter of dishes, the regulars who called her by name, the particular satisfaction of remembering exactly how someone took their tea. Work had become less a necessity and more a quiet act of staying connected to the town that had raised her. She knew which regulars needed their coffee refilled before they even lifted a hand to ask, which tourists wanted to be left alone with their view of the water, and which lonely widowers simply wanted someone to talk to for the 10 minutes it took to eat a bowl of chowder. 31 years behind that same counter had taught her more about human nature than most people learned in a lifetime, and it had also taught her, quietly and without bitterness, exactly how differently the world tended to treat people depending on the size of their wallet. Millbrook Harbor itself had always run on 2 currents, the way most small coastal towns eventually do. The working current of lobstermen, shopkeepers, teachers, and waitresses who had built the place with their own 2 hands over generations, and the seasonal current of wealthy summer residents who arrived every June in gleaming SUVs and left every September without a backward glance, treating the town less like a home and more like a well-appointed stage set for their vacations. For most of Margaret's life, those 2 currents had coexisted without much friction. It was only in the last few years, since men like Preston Wade had started buying up the waterfront 1 parcel at a time, that the friction had begun to show. Her son Daniel was a different kind of quiet. He was 34, an active-duty Navy SEAL currently attached to a special warfare unit that Margaret had learned, over the years, never to ask too many questions about. He'd been deployed more times than she could count on both hands, and each time he came home, he seemed to carry a little more weight behind his eyes, even as his shoulders stayed just as broad and his voice stayed just as gentle whenever he spoke to her. He was home now on a short emergency leave. A training injury, nothing serious, just enough downtime to see his mother before his unit rotated out again. Daniel had grown up on Harbour Street, watching his mother leave for early shifts before the sun came up and come home smelling of butter and salt air long after dark. His father, a lobsterman, had died when Daniel was 19, and it was Margaret's quiet, unglamorous work at that restaurant that had put him through his last year of community college before he enlisted. He never forgot that. Deployments to places he couldn't name over dinner, months of silence broken only by rare, heavily redacted phone calls, years of watching friends come home changed or not come home at all. Through all of it, the one fixed point in Daniel's mind had always been his mother's kitchen table and the particular sound of her voice reading the weather report out loud like it mattered. People who met Daniel for the first time rarely guessed what he did for a living. He didn't carry himself with the swagger some men mistake for strength. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed exits before he noticed menus, the way some men notice a beautiful woman across a room, an old habit his body had never quite unlearned even on the quietest nights. It wasn't paranoia. It was simply what 13 years of operating in some of the most volatile places on Earth does to a person's nervous system. It never really goes back to sleep, not completely, not even at home. At his side, wherever he went, walked Bourbon. Bourbon was a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois, sable-coated and sharp-eyed, a decorated multi-purpose canine who had done 2 overseas deployments with Daniel's unit before a shrapnel injury to his hip earned him an early, honorable retirement from active operations. Daniel had adopted him the day the paperwork cleared. Where Daniel went, Bourbon went. It wasn't sentiment. It was a bond built out of blood and trust that no civilian life could ever fully replace. That evening, Margaret had asked Daniel to stop by the restaurant near the end of her shift so they could walk home together along the water, the way they used to when he was a boy and she'd just started working there. He agreed easily, the way he agreed to most small things his mother asked of him, and settled into a corner booth with Bourbon lying calmly at his feet, waiting for her shift to wind down. The dining room that night was fuller than usual, humming with the low chatter of tourists and locals alike. Silverware clinking against porcelain, candlelight flickering against the dark windows that looked out over the harbor. Nobody in that room had any idea that the ordinary Tuesday evening they were having was about to become the thing this whole town would talk about for years. At 8:15, a black Range Rover pulled up outside and double-parked across 2 spaces without a second thought. The man who stepped out of it was Preston Wade, 51 years old, a real estate developer whose company had spent the last 3 years quietly buying up waterfront property along the Millbrook Harbor coastline. He wore a navy sport coat that fit him the way expensive things fit people who never had to think about money, and he walked like a man who had never once in his adult life waited for anything. Behind him came his wife, Diane, elegant and tired-looking in a way that makeup couldn't quite hide, and their business associate, a slick, silver-haired man named Garrett Holloway, who ran the town's zoning board when he wasn't busy pretending he didn't. The 3 of them were seated at the best table in the house within 90 seconds of walking through the door, because the Gilded Oyster's owner, a nervous man named Walter, knew exactly whose money kept his restaurant's lights on. Margaret was assigned their table. She approached it the way she approached every table, with a warm, practiced smile and a pot of coffee in her hand. "Good evening, folks. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Preston Wade didn't look up from his phone. Pellegrino. Cold. Not from the tap water you people call sparkling. "Of course," Margaret said pleasantly and went to fetch it. The evening might have ended there, unremarkable, if Preston Wade had been the kind of man capable of being satisfied. But he was not. His salmon arrived 2 minutes later than he expected, and he sent it back, calling it an insult to the fish. His wife's wineglass had, in his estimation, a smudge on the rim, though the light in the room made it impossible for anyone else to see it. He complained about the temperature of the dining room, the volume of the music, and the amateur hour service, loudly enough that surrounding tables began to grow quiet, the way a restaurant does when everyone senses a storm gathering at one particular table. Margaret absorbed each complaint with the same steady grace she'd used for 3 decades of working retail in a resort town. She apologized where an apology was warranted, corrected what could be corrected, and kept her voice even and kind. The way her late husband used to say was the mark of real strength. Not loudness, but the refusal to be provoked into becoming someone you weren't. "This salmon is closer to raw than it is to cooked," Wade announced to the table beside him as much as to Margaret, holding his fork aloft like evidence in a trial only he was presiding over. "I don't know what kind of kitchen you're running back there, but I didn't fly a private chef out from Boston last summer to eat this kind of garbage tonight." "I'll have the kitchen fire you a fresh piece right away, sir," Margaret said, already reaching for the plate. "I apologize for the inconvenience." "Don't apologize," Wade snapped. "Fix it. There's a difference." Diane Wade shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing toward the next table where a young couple had gone very quiet over their own dinners. Preston, perhaps you could let me handle this, Diane, Wade said without looking at her, and she folded her hands in her lap and said nothing further. Garrett Holloway, for his part, seemed almost entertained by the whole display, swirling his wine and watching Margaret's retreating back with the mild amusement of a man watching a sport he had no personal stake in. "You've got quite the temper tonight, Preston," he said, chuckling. "Remind me never to bring you somewhere the service isn't up to your very particular standards." "Everywhere is beneath my standards these days, Garrett," Wade replied, not quite joking. "That's the whole problem with this town. Nobody understands the difference between good enough and actually good." When Margaret returned with a replacement plate, Wade barely glanced at it before waving her off with 2 fingers, already back on his phone. It was only when the check arrived, nearly 40 minutes later, that the evening's simmering irritation finally found its target. It was the check that broke the dam. Preston Wade snatched the leather folder out of Margaret's hand, flipped it open, and his face went a mottled shade of a red. "You've got to be joking," he said, his voice climbing. "You charged me for a bottle of wine I sent back." "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me check with the kitchen," Margaret said gently, reaching for the folder. "I'm sure it's just an error on the ticket." "It's not an error. It's incompetence," Wade snapped, standing so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. The dining room, which had already gone half quiet, went fully silent. "Do you know who I am? I own half this town's waterfront. I could buy this restaurant tonight and fire every single one of you by morning, starting with you." "Sir, please, there's no need to." What happened next took less than 2 seconds, but it would be replayed, described, and dissected for the rest of the year. Preston Wade's open hand came across Margaret Doyle's face with enough force to knock her glasses clean off and send her stumbling backward into an empty chair. The sound of it cracked through the dining room like a dropped plate, sharp and final. Margaret's hand flew to her cheek, her eyes wide with a shock that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with disbelief. For a long, terrible moment, nobody in that room moved. 30 guests sat frozen, forks suspended over plates, wine glasses halfway to lips. Walter, the owner, stood by the kitchen door with his mouth slightly open, doing the math on his mortgage instead of his morals. Diane Wade looked down at her napkin, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Garrett Holloway actually smirked, as if he'd just watched a mildly amusing scene in a play he'd already seen a dozen times. It was the silence that would haunt people afterward more than the slap itself. The silence of 30 adults who watched an elderly woman get struck in a public dining room and said absolutely nothing. And then a low, deep growl rolled through that silence like distant thunder. Bourbon was already on his feet. His ears were pinned forward, his lips curled just enough to show the edge of his teeth. Every muscle along his sable coat coiled tight and trembling with restrained intent. He did not lunge. He did not bark. He simply stood, radiating a kind of controlled menace that made the hair rise on every arm in that room, his amber eyes locked on Preston Wade with a focus that looked almost surgical. Daniel Doyle rose from the booth without a sound. He was not a large man in the way people picture soldiers in movies. No bulging cartoon muscles, no scowling brow. He was lean, economical, dressed in a plain grey Henleyan jeans, the kind of man you might walk past twice without noticing. But there was something in the way he moved, a fluid, unhurried certainty, that made the entire dining room instinctively part for him as he crossed the floor toward his mother. "Mom," he said quietly, kneeling beside her chair, his voice gentle in a way that contrasted sharply with the stillness in his eyes. "Are you hurt?" "I'm all right, Danny," Margaret whispered, her hand trembling as she touched her reddened cheek. "I'm all right. Please, don't." But Daniel was already standing, already turning to face Preston Wade, and the temperature in that dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees in the space of a breath. "You just put your hand on my mother," Daniel said. His voice was flat, quiet, almost gentle, and somehow that made it 100 times more frightening than if he had shouted. Preston Wade, still riding the high of his own outburst, straightened his jacket and sneered. "And who exactly are you supposed to be? Her bodyguard?" "I'm her son," Daniel said. "And you're going to sit back down, apologize, and wait here until the police arrive." Wade laughed, an ugly, incredulous sound. "The police? Son, I fund the police department in this town. I bought the new patrol cars myself. You have absolutely no idea who you're talking to." Daniel didn't answer that. He simply reached down and gently helped his mother out of her chair, guiding her toward a nearby seat with the careful precision of a man trained to move wounded people through chaos without wasting a single motion. Bourbon shifted his position without command, placing his body between Wade and the booth, still radiating that low, controlled growl like an idling engine. It was Garrett Holloway who made the call to Millbrook Harbor's police department, and it was Chief Roy Talbot himself who answered it. Not because a crime had occurred, but because he recognized the name on his caller ID and knew exactly which side of this he was expected to land on. Chief Talbot arrived 11 minutes later, sauntering into the restaurant with the unhurried gait of a man who had already decided the outcome of the situation before he'd even stepped out of his cruiser. He was 58, thick around the middle, with a silver mustache he was vain about, and a badge he'd stopped earning the honest way years earlier. He nodded at Preston Wade first, before he even glanced at the woman with the reddening handprint still visible on her cheek. "Preston," Talbot said warmly. "Everything all right here?" "Roy, thank God," Wade said, already shifting into the role of the wronged party. "This lunatic and his attack dog assaulted me and my wife over a billing dispute. I want him arrested." Talbot turned toward Daniel with a practiced, unbothered expression, the look of a man who had smoothed over dozens of situations like this for dozens of wealthy people over the years. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside with me." "He slapped my mother across the face in front of 30 witnesses, Daniel said evenly, nodding toward the row of frozen diners. "There's your assault, Chief. Ask any one of them." Talbot didn't even glance at the witnesses. "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be, son. Why don't you take your mother and your dog and head on home, and we'll call it a misunderstanding." It was the same tired script small towns everywhere had used for decades to protect the people who wrote the checks, and Daniel had seen enough corrupted systems in enough corners of the world to recognize it instantly for what it was. "This is not a misunderstanding," Daniel said, his voice never rising, never wavering. "This is a documented assault on an elderly woman, in a room full of witnesses, and I expect a formal police report filed tonight. If it isn't, I will be making calls of my own. And I promise you, Chief, the people I know don't answer to Preston Wade's checkbook." Something in the flatness of his tone made Chief Talbot pause. Just for a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he masked it with practiced authority. "Now listen here." "No," Daniel said quietly. "You listen. My mother is going home. That man is going to sit right there until real officers arrive to take a real statement. And if you try to sweep this under a rug built out of his money, you're going to find out exactly how far the consequences travel." He helped his mother to her feet, gave Bourbon a small hand signal to heel at his side, and walked her out of the Gilded Oyster without another word, leaving behind a stunned dining room, a red-faced police chief, and a millionaire who had just made the single worst mistake of his very comfortable life. What none of them realized in that moment was that a young waiter named Corey Lindqvist had quietly pulled out his phone the second Preston Wade stood up from his chair and had recorded every single second of it in crisp, unshakable clarity. Daniel drove his mother home along the harbor road in silence, the ocean fog pressing soft and grey against the windshield. Margaret sat with an ice pack from the restaurant's kitchen pressed to her cheek, staring out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the way they had been the day they buried her husband. "You didn't have to do all that, Danny," she said finally, her voice small. "It's not worth the trouble. Men like that always find a way to come out on top." "Not this time," Daniel said, his eyes steady on the road ahead. "Mom, I've spent 13 years learning how to identify a threat and neutralize it without letting emotion cloud the decision. Tonight, for the first time in my career, the threat was standing 3 feet from my mother, and I am not going to pretend that doesn't change things." Bourbon, curled in the back seat, lifted his head briefly at the tension in Daniel's voice, then settled again, trusting his handler completely. That trust had been built the hard way. Over 2 deployments and countless small moments, neither of them would ever describe to anyone outside their unit. Nights spent shoulder to shoulder, in places where a single mistake meant one of them didn't come home. Mornings spent in silence that needed no words, because both of them already understood exactly what the other was thinking. Whatever storm Daniel decided to walk into next, Bourbon had long ago made his own quiet decision to walk into it right beside him, and nothing about a small coastal town or an arrogant man in an expensive suit was going to change that. They reached Margaret's small house near the water, and Daniel got her settled with tea and a bag of frozen peas for her cheek before he stepped out onto the porch and made a call on an encrypted satellite phone he rarely used for anything personal. The voice that answered was gruff, immediate, and entirely without pleasantries. "This is Chief Petty Officer Daniel Doyle," he said, his voice dropping into the flat procedural cadence of a man delivering an operational report rather than a personal complaint. "I'm reporting a physical assault against a civilian dependent in Millbrook Harbor, Maine. The assailant is a local businessman named Preston Wade. Local law enforcement, specifically Police Chief Roy Talbot, appears to be compromised and unwilling to file charges. I have multiple civilian witnesses and believe video evidence exists. Requesting guidance on escalation to federal channels given the apparent corruption of local authority." The voice on the other end told him exactly what he needed to hear: to document everything, secure any video evidence he could, and that a formal inquiry could be initiated through NCIS liaison channels if local processes continued to fail a military dependent. Daniel thanked him, ended the call, and stood for a long moment on the porch, looking out at the dark water, letting the cold air settle the anger he had kept so carefully controlled inside the restaurant. Before he went back inside, old habits made him walk the perimeter of his mother's small property the way he'd walked perimeters in a dozen countries whose names never made it into any conversation with civilians. He noted the street lamp that had been out for 3 weeks, the neighbor's dog that barked twice and then stopped, the particular way the fog thinned near the water and thickened again near the tree line. Everything read as normal. He told himself that, and mostly believed it. It was near midnight, sitting in his truck outside her house with Bourbon dozing across the bench seat, that he first noticed the sedan. It was parked half a block down, engine off, lights off, positioned at an angle that gave a clear sightline to Margaret's front porch without appearing to be watching anything at all. The kind of parking job that meant nothing to an ordinary observer and meant everything to a man trained to read the geometry of surveillance. He didn't approach it. He simply memorized the plate, the make, the slight hesitation of brake lights when he pulled his own truck out 10 minutes later, as if the driver were deciding whether following him was worth the risk of being noticed. He didn't sleep that night, not really. He sat in the dark of his mother's guest room, with his laptop open, running the plate through channels a civilian wouldn't have access to, and found what he expected to find. The sedan was registered to a private security firm out of Portland that, according to public filings, had done contract work for exactly one client in the last 2 years, Coastal Crown Development. Bourbon lay against the door the entire night, ears twitching at every passing car, and Daniel didn't tell his mother any of it in the morning. There are some kinds of worry, he had learned a long time ago, that only make a person less safe by being spoken out loud too soon. Instead, he made her coffee, kissed the top of her head, and quietly began building the file that would eventually become the backbone of a federal case. Meanwhile, back at the Gilded Oyster, Corey Lindqvist sat in his car in the employee parking lot, hands shaking slightly as he watched the video back on his phone for the 3rd time. He was 23, working 2 jobs to pay off community college, and he understood with total clarity that what he was holding in his hands was either going to be the most important thing he'd ever done, or the thing that got him fired and blacklisted from every restaurant in 3 counties. He thought about Margaret, who had covered his shifts more than once when his car broke down, who always slipped him a piece of pie from the kitchen on slow nights, who had never once in 5 years spoken to him like he was beneath her. He thought about Preston Wade's laugh as he stood over her, the casual cruelty of a man who had simply never been told he couldn't. He uploaded the video to 3 different social media platforms before he even started his car, with a simple caption: "Millionaire slaps 68-year-old waitress at the Gilded Oyster tonight. She didn't do anything wrong. Somebody needs to see this." By midnight, the video had 30,000 views. By 6 in the morning, it had crossed 2 million. Preston Wade woke to the sound of his phone buzzing itself off his nightstand. He assumed at first it was business, an early call from a contractor, or his lawyer with good news about a permit. Instead, his assistant's voice on the other end was tight with a panic he had never heard from her before. "Mr. Wade, you need to see this. It's everywhere. Every local station, half the national outlets. It's trending, sir. They're calling you the Millbrook Millionaire." Wade sat up in his enormous bed, pulled up the video on his own phone, and felt something cold settle in his stomach as he watched himself, in high definition, backhand an elderly woman across the face while a room full of strangers watched in silence. The comment section beneath the video was a wall of fury, thousands of strangers demanding his name, his company's name, his address, his head. By 9 that morning, the story had been picked up by 3 regional news stations. By noon, a national morning show was airing the clip with the faces blurred, except for his own, which someone in the control room had apparently decided didn't deserve the courtesy. Comment sections filled with strangers from cities Preston Wade had never visited, all of them united in the same simple, furious question: how does a grown man justify striking an elderly woman over a restaurant bill? And why did an entire room full of people just sit there and let it happen? Veterans organizations picked up the story once word spread that the woman's son was active-duty military, sharing it with captions praising Daniel's restraint under a headline he never asked for and never wanted. Local business owners along Harbour Street began quietly posting messages of support for Margaret in their shop windows. A teenager 2 towns overstarted a hand-lettered sign campaign outside Coastal Crown's regional office reading simply, "Leave Margaret alone," which itself became a small viral moment of its own within 48 hours. Reporters began digging, and it didn't take long before they found what they were looking for. Preston Wade's company, Coastal Crown Development, had spent the last 3 years quietly acquiring waterfront parcels along Millbrook Harbour, using a combination of aggressive lowball offers and, according to several anonymous sources, less-than-legal pressure tactics against homeowners who refused to sell. And connected to every one of those acquisitions, in some official or unofficial capacity, was Police Chief Roy Talbot and Zoning Board Chairman Garrett Holloway, the 3 men who had built their comfortable little arrangement in the shadows of a sleepy coastal town suddenly found their names trending beside hashtags like Justice for Margaret and Millbrook Millionaire, and none of them had the faintest idea how to make it stop. The retaliation, when it came, was swift and deliberately cruel, aimed not at Daniel, who was, even Preston Wade's lawyers agreed, untouchable given his military status and the mountain of witnesses, but at the people around the edges of the story who seemed easier to silence. Corey Lindqvist was fired from the Gilded Oyster within 24 hours, Walter citing a vague violation of the restaurant's social media policy while refusing to make eye contact as he said it. Corey stood in the small back office, where he'd been given his first job at 17, holding his final paycheck, and felt something between grief and disbelief settle into his chest. "You know this is wrong, Walter," Corey said quietly. "You know exactly what you're doing right now." Walter wouldn't look up from his desk. "It's just business, Corey. I've got a mortgage on this building, and Wade's company holds paper on half the block. I can't fight that. Nobody can." A corporate representative from Coastal Crown Development called Corey's second job, a hardware store, that same afternoon and suggested, in vague but unmistakable terms, that continuing to employ him might create complications. With certain permits the store needed renewed. Corey lost that job by the end of the week too, and for 3 days he sat in his apartment answering messages from strangers online who called him a hero, wondering privately how heroism was supposed to pay his rent. Word of what had happened to Corey reached Daniel through his mother, who had heard it from another waitress at church, and Daniel drove to Corey's apartment that same evening. He didn't offer empty comfort. He simply sat across the kitchen table from a scared 23-year-old and laid out, in plain terms, exactly what kind of legal protection existed for a witness facing retaliation for reporting a crime, and exactly what documentation he needed to start keeping from that point forward. "You did the right thing," Daniel told him. "The right thing is rarely the easy thing, and sometimes it costs you before it pays you back. But it will pay you back. I'm going to make sure of that personally." Then came the visit to Margaret's house. 2 nights after the video went viral, someone slashed all 4 tires on Margaret's old sedan in her driveway and left a single word spray painted across her garage door in dripping red letters: "Quiet." Margaret found it at 6 in the morning when she went out for the newspaper and stood staring at it for a long moment before she called her son, her voice steadier than she felt. Daniel arrived within the hour, and the man who examined that garage door was no longer the gentle son who had brought his mother tea the night of the slap. He photographed everything, dusted for prints with a small kit he happened to have in his truck, and made another call. This one not to a distant colleague, but directly to Chief Talbot's cell phone. "Chief," Daniel said, his voice a low, dangerous calm. "Someone vandalized my mother's property last night and left what any reasonable person would call a threat. I expect a police report and an active investigation opened within the hour." There was a long pause on the other end. "Now, Mr. Doyle, we don't know that this is connected to." "You'll open the investigation," Daniel said, "or I will personally drive to the state police barracks and file a federal civil rights complaint naming you specifically as an accessory to witness intimidation. Your choice, Chief." The report was filed within the hour. Nothing ever came of it. No suspect, no arrest, the kind of investigation that exists only on paper to make a problem look handled. But Daniel had expected that. He was no longer building a case for local justice. He was building a case for something much bigger, and every act of cowardice and corruption from Talbot only added another brick to the wall he was quietly constructing. Preston Wade, watching his empire begin to wobble beneath him, made one more attempt to control the situation the only way he had ever truly understood, through force disguised as coincidence. 3 nights after the vandalism at Margaret's house, Daniel took Bourbon for a late walk along the darkened stretch of dock behind the old cannery, a route he'd taken 100 times as a boy. The fog had come in thick that night, muffling sound the way it always did along that stretch of coastline, and Daniel noticed the 2 men step out from behind a stack of lobster traps before Bourbon did, which almost never happened. They were big, thick through the shoulders in the particular way of men who spent money on gym memberships rather than honest labor, both of them wearing the kind of bland windbreakers that private security firms hand out by the dozen. The taller of the 2 cracked his knuckles with theatrical slowness. "Heard you've been making a lot of noise around town, Navy boy," he said, stepping into Daniel's path. "Mister, Wade thought maybe you needed a reminder that noise has consequences." Bourbon's ears pinned flat, a low growl beginning low in his chest, but Daniel's hand found the top of the dog's head without him even looking down, a silent command that kept the animal rooted in place. "You've got about 4 seconds to reconsider whatever this is," Daniel said, his voice carrying the same flat, unhurried calm it always did, the tone of a man who had faced considerably worse odds in considerably worse places and found them, on balance, less concerning than a parking ticket. The second man didn't wait for 4 seconds. He swung a heavy right hand toward Daniel's jaw, the kind of looping, telegraphed punch that might end a bar fight between 2 untrained men, but that Daniel had been trained since the age of 20 to read 3/4 of a second before it ever landed. He stepped inside the arc of the swing instead of away from it, caught the man's wrist, and used the attacker's own forward momentum to drive him face first into the wet planks of the dock, pinning his arm at an angle that stopped just shy of anything a hospital would need to fix. The taller man hesitated, weighing the sudden, undeniable evidence in front of him against whatever fee he'd been promised for the night's work, and in that half-second of hesitation, Daniel released his first attacker, straightened, and simply looked at him. Go back and tell Preston Wade, Daniel said quietly, that every single thing that happens to me, to my mother, or to anyone connected to this case from this point forward gets logged, time-stamped, and handed directly to federal investigators. Tell him he just added attempted assault on a federal witness to whatever charges are already coming his way. And tell him that if he sends anyone else down here, I won't be nearly this patient. The two men helped each other up off the dock and disappeared into the fog without another word, and Daniel walked the rest of the route with Bourbon, exactly as he'd planned to, refusing to let two hired men steal even one more minute of his evening. He filed a full written report with Agent Cole's office the following morning, complete with a partial license plate he'd memorized off the van idling 2 blocks away. One more thread in the rope that was slowly, steadily tightening around Preston Wade's throat. Agent Cole had, in fact, already begun quietly interviewing witnesses from that night nearly a week before Diane Wade ever reached out, working methodically through the restaurant's reservation list, one name at a time. Most of the 30 diners who had watched Preston Wade strike Margaret Doyle without saying a word were, by then, deeply ashamed of their own silence, and that shame turned out to be a surprisingly effective tool for an investigator patient enough to let it work on its own. The young couple who had been seated nearest the Wade table admitted, once Agent Cole sat across from them at their kitchen table with a recorder between them, that they had discussed reporting what they'd seen that same night, and then talked themselves out of it, afraid of exactly the kind of retaliation Corey Lindfist had ended up facing anyway. An elderly widower who dined at the Gilded Oyster every Tuesday for 30 years told the agent, almost apologetically, that he'd recognized Preston Wade's face from a fundraising dinner years earlier and assumed, in the moment, that reporting a man that powerful would simply be a waste of everyone's time. You'd be surprised how many people tell me some version of that same sentence, Agent Cole said to Daniel one afternoon, going over her notes at Margaret's kitchen table, while Bourbon dozed by the wood stove. Not evil people. Not even particularly cowardly people, most of them. Just people who've been taught, one small compromise at a time, that some names are too big to challenge. That's usually how towns like this end up the way they end up. It isn't one bad man. It's 30 ordinary people who decide, every single day, that it isn't their fight. It only takes one person deciding otherwise to change the math, Daniel said quietly. It took 2 this time, Cole said, glancing toward the front porch, where Margaret was hanging laundry despite the cold, humming to herself the way she always did. Your mother went back to work at that restaurant. Every single person who ate there had to look at her again, had to remember exactly what they'd watched happen and done nothing about. That's its own kind of pressure, Mr. Doyle. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear. By the time Diane Wade made her call to Margaret, Agent Cole already had a thick file of witness statements, corroborating the assault beyond any reasonable doubt. What she didn't have yet, what made Diane's flash drive the true turning point of the entire case, was hard, documented proof connecting Preston Wade's temper to the much larger and far more damaging conspiracy quietly strangling the town's waterfront out from under its own long-time residents. The break came from the one place Preston Wade never expected, his own house. Diane Wade had spent 18 years married to a man whose cruelty she had trained herself not to see. The way people train themselves to ignore a persistent, low hum in an old house until one day, for no clear reason, they simply cannot unhear it anymore. Watching that video of her husband's hand connecting with an elderly woman's face, watching the casual, practiced way he'd stepped over the consequences his entire life, had been the sound finally growing too loud to ignore. She had also, over the years, quietly kept track of things. A ledger here, a series of texts there, an offshore account statement she'd found once while looking for tax documents and never mentioned. She had told herself for years it was insurance, a security blanket against a divorce she was too afraid to pursue. Now she understood it for what it actually was, evidence of a small, rotten empire built on threats and bribery. One that had just backhanded an innocent woman on camera in front of the whole country. She called Margaret Doyle on a Thursday afternoon, her voice trembling but resolute. "Mrs. Doyle, my name is Diane Wade. I know I have absolutely no right to ask anything of you, but I need to meet with you. I have information about my husband and Chief Talbot and Garrett Holloway that I think your son needs to see." They met the next day at St. Anne's, a small stone chapel on the edge of town that had stood empty most weekdays for as long as anyone could remember. Margaret sat in a pew near the front, and Diane slid in behind her, close enough to speak in a whisper, her hands trembling around a small flash drive she pressed into Margaret's palm. "Everything is on there," Diane whispered. Bank records showing payments from Preston to Chief Talbot going back 4 years. Recordings of meetings where they discussed pressuring homeowners who wouldn't sell their waterfront land. Text messages where Preston explicitly orders Garrett Holloway to reject permits for anyone who refuses his offers. "It's all there. I copied it from a safe in his study 3 nights ago." "Why give this to me?" Margaret asked gently. "Why not the police?" Diane let out a short, bitter laugh. "Because the police in this town belong to my husband, Mrs. Doyle. I trust your son. Everyone in this town has watched him for the last 2 weeks, calm as still water, refusing to let this go while everyone else tried to bury it. I trust a man like that to get this into hands my husband can't buy." Margaret closed her fingers around the small drive, feeling its weight far beyond its size. "You understand what you're risking, Mrs. Wade. This isn't a small thing you're handing me." "I understand it better than you'd think," Diane said, her eyes fixed on the plain wooden cross at the front of the chapel. "I've spent 18 years understanding exactly how far Preston will go to protect what he thinks belongs to him. I watched him raise his hand to a stranger on television like it was nothing to him at all, and I realized I had spent almost 2 decades quietly deciding that was somehow not my business. It is my business, Mrs. Doyle. It always was." She reached out and hesitantly took Margaret's hand in both of hers. "I am so sorry for what he did to you. I should have said something the moment it happened, in that dining room, in front of everyone. I didn't. That is a cowardice I will have to live with, regardless of what happens next. The least I can do now is make sure it costs him everything it's costed you." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "It's never too late to choose the harder thing, dear. I learned that a long time ago, raising a boy who chose the harder thing for a living." When Margaret handed the drive to Daniel that evening, he sat at her kitchen table and opened the files on a hardened laptop he'd brought back from his last deployment, one built for exactly this kind of secure, offline analysis. Spreadsheet after spreadsheet bloomed across the screen. Dates, dollar amounts, initials that matched Talbot's badge number, and Holloway's zoning board email. An audio file captured Preston Wade's voice, cold and casual, instructing Talbot to lean a little harder on an elderly widow who wouldn't sell her cottage on the point. Another showed a scanned deed transfer for a waterfront lot, sold for a fraction of its worth to a shell company that traced straight back to Coastal Crown Development. It was, in the plainest possible terms, a documented criminal conspiracy spanning years involving extortion, bribery, and the systematic abuse of local government to strip ordinary families of their land. Daniel picked up his satellite phone and made the second call of the case, his voice hard as forged steel. "This is Chief Petty Officer Daniel Doyle. I need to report evidence of a multi-year public corruption scheme involving a local police chief and zoning official, connected to the assault case I flagged previously. I'm requesting immediate coordination with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and a formal handoff, given that local law enforcement here is directly implicated. This needs to move fast, and it needs to move from the top down." The federal response arrived the way real power always does, quietly, without sirens, in a pair of unmarked black sedans that rolled into Millbrook Harbor just after dawn 4 days later. Special Agent Renata Cole of the FBI's Boston field office stepped out of the lead car in a charcoal pantsuit, her expression giving away absolutely nothing, and walked straight up to Daniel's mother's porch, where he was waiting with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. "Mr. Doyle," she said, extending a hand. "Agent Cole, we've reviewed everything your contact forwarded us. This is significant. We're opening a full investigation into Coastal Crown Development, Chief Talbot, and Mr. Holloway, effective immediately." Over the following 72 hours, the quiet, foggy little town of Millbrook Harbor became the site of the most dramatic single week in its 300-year history. Chief Roy Talbot was arrested at the police station he'd run for 11 years, led out in handcuffs past his own stunned officers on charges of bribery, extortion, and obstruction of justice. He tried, in the parking lot, to invoke the same tone of casual authority that had worked on generations of Millbrook residents. "You people have no jurisdiction here," he blustered at Agent Cole as she guided him toward the sedan. "I've run this department for 11 years. I know everyone in this county." "You knew everyone in this county, Chief Talbot," Agent Cole replied evenly, without breaking stride. "As of this morning, your jurisdiction is a holding cell and a very long conversation with federal prosecutors." It did not work on federal agents, and it worked even less on the young officers who stood on the station steps, watching their chief loaded into the back of an unmarked sedan, several of them quietly relieved that someone had finally done what they had never had the standing or the courage to do themselves. Garrett Holloway was picked up at the zoning board office he had used as his personal instrument of coercion for nearly a decade, his protest about due process falling on the deaf ears of two agents who had heard every version of that excuse before. He asked, twice, if there was any way this could be handled quietly, professionally, like reasonable men. And both times was met with the same flat silence that told him more clearly than words ever could exactly how reasonable men handled bribery in this particular jurisdiction. Preston Wade attempted, predictably, to run. He had a private plane fueled and waiting at the regional airport, his passport and a hard drive of encrypted financial records already loaded aboard, when a line of federal vehicles blocked the taxiway before his jet could even reach the runway. Agent Cole herself walked up the folding stairs to the cabin door, flanked by two armed agents, and found Wade sitting rigid in a leather seat with a glass of scotch he never got the chance to finish. "Mr. Wade," she said, holding up her credentials, "you're under arrest for extortion, bribery of a public official, and assault. I'd suggest you finish that drink slowly, because it's going to be the last one you have outside a state facility for quite some time." He was pulled from the cabin in his $3,000 suit, hands cuffed behind his back, his face contorted in the specific disbelieving fury of a man discovering, for the very first time in his life, that money could not simply make a problem disappear. The weeks that followed felt, to the people of Millbrook Harbor, like watching a long winter finally break. The state appointed an interim town administrator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Yoon, to oversee zoning and law enforcement while the investigation continued, and residents who had quietly sold their waterfront parcels under years of pressure began filing claims to have those sales reviewed and, in several cases, reversed entirely. Old Mr. Abernathy, who had owned 3 acres on the point his family had fished off of for 4 generations before Coastal Crown pressured him into selling for a fraction of its worth 2 years earlier, stood in front of the newly reopened town hall the week his deed was legally restored and wept openly in a way none of his neighbors had ever seen him do, not even at his own wife's funeral. The Kowalski family, whose small cottage near the lighthouse had been the target of 3 separate code violation citations in a single winter, none of which any inspector could ever quite explain, received a formal letter of apology from the town, along with the restoration of their property records. Patricia Yoon made a point of personally attending each of these small ceremonies, understanding better than most that healing a town wasn't only a matter of prosecuting the guilty, but of publicly, visibly making the wronged whole again wherever it was still possible. Corey Lindquist was rehired at the Gilded Oyster within the week, this time by a regional restaurant group that bought out Walter's lease after his complicity in the cover-up became public knowledge and his reservation book emptied overnight. The new ownership brought Corey on not as a waiter but as an assistant manager, a promotion that came with a framed, handwritten note from Margaret herself, thanking him for having the courage that 30 other adults in that dining room hadn't. Corey kept the note taped inside his locker for the rest of the year. Diane Wade filed for divorce the same week her husband was formally indicted. And though the town's opinion of her remained complicated for a while, Most people eventually agreed that the courage it had taken to hand over that flash drive deserved something more than lingering suspicion. She sold the enormous house on the bluff that she had never really felt at home in and moved into a modest cottage near the library, where she began volunteering 3 mornings a week, slowly rebuilding a version of herself that had nothing to do with her husband's name or his money. She and Margaret, improbably, became something like friends, meeting for tea every other Sunday. 2 women who had both, in their own very different ways, finally stopped staying quiet. Walter closed the Gilded Oyster's old management office for good and left town within the month, unable to face the quiet, unspoken judgment of neighbors who had once trusted him and watched him choose Preston Wade's money over an employee of 31 years. Nobody in Millbrook Harbor seemed particularly sorry to see him go. Margaret Doyle went back to work at the Gilded Oyster 2 weeks after the incident, against her son's gentle protests that she didn't need to anymore. "I know I don't need to, Danny," she told him, tying her apron on in front of the same mirror she'd used for 31 years. "But this town needs to see that people like Preston Wade don't get to chase good women out of the rooms they've spent their whole lives building." The trial began on a cold morning in early December. The sea,